Chapter 1: Arrival at the Precipice. The Chronos Hotel didn't loom, it presided. It sat nestled between glass and steel neighbors like a preserved tooth in a modernist jawbone, an edifice of dark brick and shadowed eaves that seemed to absorb the city light rather than reflect it. Jax dragged his worn duffel bag through the revolving doors. The sudden hush of the lobby, a stark contrast to the street noise he'd just escaped. He wasn't escaping much, really, just the crushing weight of overdue bills, a job that felt like slow decay, and the general sense of pointless entropy that clung to his small apartment like damp. The Chronos was an extravagance, a last-ditch effort to find something, perspective maybe, or just a few days where the walls didn't feel like they were closing in. He'd found a surprisingly cheap deal online for a room in their Annex Wing. Strange name, but the price was right. The lobby was opulent in an old-world way, polished marble floors that reflected the dimmed chandeliers like captured stars, plush velvet armchairs arranged in conversational pits, and a grandfather clock whose pendulum swung with hypnotic slowness. It ticked with a resonance that seemed deeper than mere mechanics, a sound that vibrated in Jax's bones. A woman stood behind the long, dark wood reception desk, her posture impeccable, her smile perfectly measured. "Welcome to the Chronos Hotel," she said, her voice smooth and placid, lacking any genuine warmth. Her name tag read Penelope Vance, floor manager. She had dark hair pulled back severely, emphasizing sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to assess rather than welcome. "Checking in." Jax nodded, giving his name. Penelope tapped keys on a vintage-looking computer terminal tucked discreetly beside a brass bell. "Ah, yes, Mr. Jax. Annex Wing, room 713. An interesting choice." Her smile didn't waver, but Jax felt a prickle of unease. "It was available," he mumbled, hoisting his bag onto the counter. "Indeed," Penelope continued, sliding a brass keycard, surprisingly heavy, not the usual flimsy plastic, across the polished surface. "The Annex Wing is located at the far end of the East Corridor, ground floor. Please note, services in the Annex may differ slightly from the main hotel." Her tone remained perfectly neutral, yet Jax detected an undercurrent, a subtle warning perhaps. "Elevators are to your left. Enjoy your stay." The elevator ride was unnerving. The brass grating, the dim lighting, the slow, deliberate ascent felt less like modern convenience and more like being swallowed. He got off at the ground floor, following signs for the East Corridor. The plush red carpet of the main hotel transitioned abruptly to something harsher, industrial gray, underfoot. The lighting became dimmer, flickering slightly in the distance. The air grew colder, carrying a strange, metallic tang mixed with something else. Ozone, perhaps. Or something vaguely organic and unpleasant, like old meat left too long in the sun. The corridor stretched before him, longer than seemed architecturally possible from the outside. Doors lined the walls, numbered sequentially, but the style changed subtly every few yards. Some were plain steel, others heavy wood, one looked bizarrely like a futuristic airlock. There was no uniformity, and the numbers, they weren't entirely sequential. He passed room 666, then suddenly 1984, then a door simply marked Zone C. His room, 713, was thankfully conventional wood, albeit scarred and darker than the others nearby. As he reached for the keycard slot, a flicker of movement caught his eye further down the hall. A bellhop dressed in an old-fashioned burgundy uniform was struggling with a luggage cart. But something was wrong. The bellhop seemed jerky, uncoordinated. His movements repeated in tiny half-second loops, reaching for the cart handle, retracting, reaching again. Then, for a terrifying instant, his form dissolved into visual static, like a badly tuned television, accompanied by a low buzzing sound that scraped Jax's nerves raw. The bellhop solidified, his face momentarily a swirl of colors before snapping back to a pale, blank expression. He didn't seem to notice Jax, continuing his stuttering attempt to push the cart, which remained stubbornly stationary. Jax swallowed hard, his hand hovering over the keycard slot. This wasn't just a cheap wing, this was the weird wing. He shook his head. Lack of sleep, stress. It had to be. He slid the heavy brass keycard into the slot. The light blinked green with a dull thunk. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, expecting. Well, he wasn't sure. Musty carpet, maybe a stained bedspread. What he saw stopped him cold. The room wasn't a room. It was an observation platform, metal grating underfoot, overlooking a desolate gray landscape under a sickly yellow sky. Twisted, skeletal trees clawed at the oppressive atmosphere. A fine, gritty ash drifted down, coating everything in a uniform layer of death. In the distance, the jagged silhouettes of ruined buildings stabbed upwards like broken teeth. The air was freezing, biting at his exposed skin, carrying the unmistakable scent of radioactive decay and long-dead fires. A Geiger counter somewhere nearby clicked erratically, a frantic, mechanical heartbeat in the silence. This wasn't a view from a window. The room was the view. He stood on the threshold, one foot in the strangely sterile corridor, the other on a metal platform overlooking the end of the world. He stumbled back, slamming the door shut. His heart hammered against his ribs. He leaned against the corridor wall, gasping for breath. What the hell was that? A projection? Some kind of ultra-realistic VR setup? But he'd felt the cold, smelled the ash. He looked back at the door. Room 713, plain, scarred wood. He reached out a trembling hand and touched it, solid, real. He tried the keycard again. Thunk. Green light. He hesitated, then cautiously pushed the door open just a crack. The same scene. Nuclear winter. Desolation absolute. The Geiger counter's frantic clicking seemed louder now. He slammed it shut again, the sound echoing unnaturally in the long corridor. "Problem with the room, sir." Jax jumped, spinning around. Penelope Vance stood there, appearing as silently as a ghost. Her placid expression was unchanged, her eyes unreadable. "The room, Jax struggled for words. "It's not a room, it's outside some kind of wasteland." Penelope tilted her head slightly. "Ah, room 713. Yes, the atomic twilight vista. Is it not to your liking? We do have other scenarios available. Perhaps the verdant decay in 715, or the crimson flood in 709. Scenarios, vistas. What are you talking about?" Jax demanded, his voice rising despite himself. "This isn't a hotel room. What is this place?" "This," Penelope said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, yet somehow becoming more menacing, "is the Apocalypse Wing, a curated collection of possible futures or pasts. Time is somewhat flexible here. Most guests find it invigorating, a reminder of what lies beyond the mundane." She gestured vaguely down the corridor. "You'll find each door offers a unique perspective." Jack stared at her, horrified. This wasn't a deal, it was a madhouse, or worse. "I want a different room in the main hotel, now." Penelope's smile tightened fractionally. "I'm afraid all rooms in the main building are currently occupied, and transfers from the Annex Wing are discouraged. Once checked in, the experience is rather binding." "Binding? What does that mean?" Before she could answer, the jerky bellhop, Glitch, Jax would later learn others called him, stuttered past them, his cart finally rolling but one wheel caught, sending a small, tarnished silver locket tumbling off. It skittered across the floor, coming to rest near Jax's feet. Glitch flickered violently, his form dissolving into static for a longer moment this time, the buzzing sound drilling into Jax's skull. Then he solidified, looking around blankly, seemingly unaware of the dropped item or their presence, and continued his jerky progress down the hall. Penelope ignored the bellhop completely. "It means," she said, her gaze fixed on Jax, cold and final, "that checkout procedures for the Apocalypse Wing are complex. We recommend guests fully immerse themselves in the offered experiences first. Perhaps you'll acquire a taste for it." Jax snatched up the locket instinctively. It was cool to the touch, intricately engraved but tarnished black. He looked from the locket to Penelope's impassive face, then back towards the terrifying promise of room 713. Invigorating. It felt like staring into the abyss. Suddenly, a low, wet, tearing sound echoed from further down the corridor, followed by a choked gurgle. It wasn't human, not entirely. Penelope didn't flinch, but her eyes briefly flickered in that direction. "Enjoy your stay, Mr. Jax," she said, turning with fluid grace. "Do try not to disturb the other exhibits." She walked away, her footsteps silent on the gray flooring, disappearing around a bend, leaving Jax alone in the cold, sterile corridor, the heavy brass keycard clutched in one hand, a tarnished locket in the other, and the chilling knowledge that behind the simple wooden door of room 713, the end of the world was waiting. The Geiger counter's clicking seemed to seep through the solid wood, a persistent reminder of the precipice upon which he now stood. The wet, tearing sound came again, closer this time. He fumbled with the key card, heart pounding, and quickly let himself into the nuclear winter. The cold was horrifying, but somehow it felt safer than the corridor. For now. Chapter 2: Echoes in the Ash. The door clicked shut behind Jax, the sound swallowed instantly by the vast, oppressive silence of the wasteland. He stood shivering on the grated metal platform, the biting cold seeping through his thin jacket far more intensely than any draft from an open window ever could. This wasn't a simulation. The grit under his boots, the acrid taste in the air, the profound, soul-crushing desolation stretching out before him under the jaundiced sky, it felt terrifyingly real. The platform extended about 10 feet out from the doorframe, which now looked jarringly out of place. a simple wooden hotel room door embedded in what seemed to be a crumbling concrete wall, possibly part of a collapsed bunker or observation post. There were no visible controls, no obvious signs of technology projecting this vista. Below the platform, the ash-covered ground sloped away into drifts, like gray, toxic snow. Twisted shards of metal and concrete jutted from the drifts, remnants of a world obliterated. The Geiger counter he'd heard wasn't just nearby. It was mounted on the wall beside the door, its needle twitching erratically in the amber zone, the clicking a frantic, insistent rhythm against the silence. Jax hugged himself, teeth chattering. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, a cold tide rising in his chest. He forced himself to take slow, deliberate breaths, the frigid air burning his lungs. Penelope Vance's words echoed in his mind. Apocalypse Wing, a curated collection of possible futures or pasts. This wasn't just a faulty room, it was intentional, a feature. He was standing inside one of the exhibits. He cautiously approached the edge of the platform. The drop wasn't immense, maybe 15 feet to the ash-covered ground below. He could probably jump down, but the thought of leaving the relative solidity of the platform, of venturing into that dead landscape, filled him with primal dread. What horrors lay hidden beneath the ash or lurking within the skeletal ruins silhouetted against the sky? He scanned the immediate area. Nothing moved except the swirling ash carried on a wind that moaned like something bereaved. The silence wasn't truly silent. It was a heavy presence, punctuated by the Geiger counter's frantic pulse and the low, mournful sigh of the wind. He noticed footprints in the ash near the base of the platform, large, indistinct shapes, partially filled in, suggesting something heavy had passed by relatively recently. He backed away from the edge, turning his attention back to the door. Could he just stay here, use it like a regular hotel room? But the cold was intense, draining his energy. There was no bed, no bathroom, just the freezing platform and the vista of annihilation. And the memory of that wet, tearing sound from the corridor reminded him that safety wasn't guaranteed even outside the vistas. He fished the tarnished silver locket from his pocket. It felt strangely heavy. He tried to pry it open, but it seemed sealed shut, either by age or design. The intricate engravings depicted swirling, abstract patterns that seemed to shift slightly under his gaze, almost like optical illusions. Holding it made his fingertips tingle faintly. He tucked it back into his pocket, unsure why he'd even picked it up, other than a reflex action when the strange bellhop dropped it. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the ruins in the distance, startlingly loud in the stillness. Jax flinched, heart leaping into his throat. He scanned the skyline but saw nothing. Just the wind, the ash, the dead world. Was he alone here, or was this vista populated? He needed to think. Trapped in a wing of horrors with a possibly insane manager and glitching staff. Transferring was discouraged. Checkout was complex. This felt less like a hotel and more like a prison, or worse, some kind of twisted experiment. He had to get out. But how? Storming back to the lobby felt futile. Penelope Vance projected an aura of absolute, unyielding control. He needed information. He needed leverage. His gaze fell back on the corridor door. What if other rooms held clues? Or maybe resources? Penelope had mentioned other scenarios. Would they all be this bleak, this hostile? The thought of opening another door, of facing another unknown apocalypse, was terrifying. But staying here, freezing on this platform while God knows what lurked in the gray silence or stalked the corridors, seemed like a slower, more certain path to death. He needed to assess the immediate danger first. That sound he'd heard in the corridor, the tearing, the gurgling, it had sounded close. He pressed his ear against the cool wood of the door, listening intently. At first, nothing but the faint hum of the corridor lights. Then he heard it again. A wet, slick, dragging sound, accompanied by low, guttural clicks and something like bubbling liquid. It was moving slowly, deliberately down the corridor, towards his room. Jax's blood ran cold. He backed away from the door, eyes wide with fear. Whatever was making that sound, he did not want to meet it. But where could he go? Back out onto the platform, jump down into the ash. The dragging sound stopped right outside his door. Silence descended, thick and suffocating, broken only by the frantic clicking of the Geiger counter beside him and the thudding of his own heart. Jax held his breath, every muscle tensed. A soft, experimental thump sounded against the door. Then another, heavier this time. Something was testing it, probing. Then came a horrifying, wet, sucking noise, like something amorphous trying to adhere to the wood. Jax scrambled backwards, stumbling towards the edge of the platform. He looked down at the ash-covered ground. 15 feet. Maybe a broken ankle, maybe worse. But it was better than facing whatever was on the other side of that door. The thumping escalated, becoming frantic, forceful blows. The wood of the doorframe groaned under the assault. Splinters flew inwards. This wasn't just testing, it was trying to break in. Decision made. Jax took a deep breath, braced himself, and leaped off the edge of the platform. He hit the ash drift with a muffled thump, the impact jarring his bones but softer than he'd expected. The ash flew up around him in a choking gray cloud, tasting bitter and metallic. He scrambled to his feet, sinking almost to his knees in the loose debris. The cold here was even more intense, numbing his fingers and toes almost instantly. Above him, the assault on the door reached a crescendo. With a final, sickening crunch, the door burst inwards, ripped partially from its hinges. And framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim corridor light, was the source of the sounds. It defied easy description. Jax could only register impressions, snapshots filtered through terror. It was large, vaguely humanoid in shape, but hideously transformed. Bulbous, pulsating sacs of fungal growth covered its form, glowing faintly with a sickly greenish light. Patches of what might have been skin were visible beneath, pale and stretched taut over unnatural bulges. Tendrils of mycelium dripped a viscous fluid, sizzling faintly as they touched the metal platform. Where a head should have been, a grotesque bloom pulsed, a fleshy, fungal structure resembling a cross between a tumor and a diseased flower, leaking spores into the air. It didn't have eyes, but Jax felt utterly, horribly seen. It let out a low, bubbling moan, a sound of mindless hunger and decay. This was Subject 7, the bloom. It shambled forward onto the platform, its movements jerky yet purposeful. It seemed to sense Jax below, the bloom atop its form quivering slightly. It took another step, its weight causing the metal grating to groan. Jax didn't hesitate. He turned and plunged deeper into the ash drifts, away from the platform, away from the monstrous fungal horror. Moving was exhausting, like wading through thick mud, the icy cold stealing his breath. He glanced back. The bloom was trying to navigate the edge of the platform, its tendrils probing the ash below, seemingly hesitant to descend. He pushed harder, scrambling over a half-buried concrete slab, tearing his jeans on jagged rebar. The ruins loomed closer now, offering potential cover but also unknown dangers. He could hear the wind whistling through broken structures, carrying faint, whispering sounds that might just have been the wind, or might have been something else entirely. He risked another look back. The bloom was still on the platform, seemingly fixated on the doorway back to the corridor, perhaps unwilling or unable to venture far into this specific vista. A small mercy, but Jax knew it was temporary. That thing was loose in the Annex Wing. It had tried to break into his room. It was hunting. He collapsed behind a shattered wall, gasping for air, his body trembling uncontrollably from cold and adrenaline. The silence pressed in again, heavy and absolute. He was alone in the nuclear wasteland, freezing, unarmed, with a fungal monstrosity potentially waiting for him back in the relative safety of the hotel corridor. He fumbled in his pocket, his numb fingers finding the locket again. He rubbed its smooth, cool surface. It was absurd, but it was the only solid thing he had right now that felt remotely connected to the world outside this nightmare. He needed a plan. Hiding here would eventually kill him from exposure. Going back to the corridor meant risking an encounter with the bloom or worse. He thought of the other doors, the other apocalypses Penelope had mentioned. Could one of them offer refuge, or perhaps supplies, a weapon? He scanned the ruins around him again. Twisted metal, shattered glass, deep shadows. Everything looked hostile, broken. But then he saw it further away, partially obscured by drifting ash, another door. It wasn't identical to his room 713 door. This one was heavy steel, like a vault, set into another crumbling concrete structure. It bore no number, only a small, faded biohazard symbol. Another vista, another potential apocalypse. Could it be worse than this frozen hellscape? Worse than the fungal horror waiting in the hall? Jax wasn't sure. But staying put was suicide. Going back felt like walking into a trap. The only option left was to push forward, deeper into the curated nightmare of the Chronos Hotel. He pushed himself to his feet, the grit grinding under his boots, and started making his slow, painful way towards the steel door. The Geiger counter's insistent clicking from room 713 growing fainter behind him, replaced only by the mournful sigh of the dead wind. Chapter 3: The Emerald Contagion. The trek through the ash was slow torture. Each step was a struggle, Jax's boots sinking deep into the loose, gritty powder that seemed to suck the warmth from his already freezing limbs. The cold was relentless, a physical weight pressing down on him, making his muscles ache and his breathing ragged. He pulled his thin jacket tighter, a futile gesture against the pervasive chill that felt like it was penetrating his very bones. The silence of the dead world was broken only by his own labored gasps, and the incessant, mournful whisper of the wind, stirring the ash into ghostly eddies. He kept glancing back towards room 713, a dark rectangle against the gray concrete, but the bloom didn't emerge. Perhaps the specific atmospheric conditions of the atomic twilight vista were as alien and hostile to it as they were to him. Small comfort. It was still out there, somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors of the Annex Wing. He focused on the steel door ahead, his goal. It grew slowly larger as he struggled through the drifts, the faded orange and black biohazard symbol becoming clearer, stark against the pitted metal. What kind of apocalypse awaited behind it? Biological plague, mutagenic disaster, toxic environment. None of the possibilities were appealing, but the alternative was freezing to death out here or returning to face the fungal horror. The ruins he navigated were unsettlingly silent. Shattered remnants of buildings clawed at the oppressive yellow sky like skeletal fingers. He passed the frozen husk of a bus, its windows shattered, its interior filled with drifting ash. Through a broken window, he glimpsed shapes huddled on the seats, vaguely human forms, encased in a thick layer of gray frost and ash, permanent passengers on a final, fatal journey. He didn't look too closely, scurrying past, the image burning itself into his mind. Further on, he stumbled upon a cluster of strange, crystalline structures jutting from the ash. They pulsed with a faint, internal blue light, emitting a low hum that made his teeth vibrate. Radiation. Some bizarre post-apocalyptic life form. He gave them a wide berth, the Geiger counter's click still echoing in his memory. This place wasn't just dead. It was actively hostile, even in its stillness. Finally, exhausted and shivering violently, he reached the structure housing the steel door. It seemed to be part of a heavily reinforced bunker or laboratory entrance, concrete walls thick and stained. The door itself was massive, set deep into the wall with a heavy wheel-like handle in the center, reminiscent of a submarine hatch or bank vault. There was no keycard slot, no handle, just the wheel and the ominous biohazard symbol. He placed his numb hands on the cold steel wheel. It felt incredibly heavy. He pushed, then pulled, throwing all his weight into it. With a groan of protesting metal, it began to turn, stiffly resisting him. Each turn was a monumental effort, his muscles screaming, his breath plumbing white in the frigid air. Slowly, reluctantly, locking bolts retracted with loud clunks from within the door's frame. After what felt like an eternity, the wheel stopped turning. The door was unlocked. Jax hesitated for a moment, hand hovering over the recessed lever that presumably opened the door. He listened. No sounds came from within, unlike the obvious horrors behind room 713. Taking another shaky breath, bracing himself for whatever lay beyond, he pulled the lever. With a hiss of escaping pressure, the heavy steel door swung inwards, revealing not darkness but an explosion of vibrant, impossible green. Warm, humid air, thick with the scent of damp earth, rotting vegetation, and cloyingly sweet blossoms, washed over him, a shocking contrast to the biting cold of the wasteland. He stepped through the doorway, leaving the gray ash and biting wind behind, and found himself on a narrow, rusting metal catwalk overlooking a scene of rampant, unnatural growth. He was inside a vast, cavernous space, perhaps a biodome or a massive containment facility. But the original structure was almost entirely consumed by vegetation. Vines thick as pythons snaked across the catwalk railings and hung in dense curtains from the distant, glass-paneled ceiling, much of which was cracked or missing, letting in shafts of the same sickly yellow light from the wasteland outside, filtered now through a canopy of gigantic, overlapping leaves. Below him, the floor was a chaotic jungle floor. Enormous ferns, fungi glowing with phosphorescent light in shades of blue and purple, bizarrely shaped flowers the size of dinner plates that seemed to track his movement, and trees whose bark pulsed faintly with internal light. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and vibrated with the drone of unseen insects and the chirps, clicks, and rustles of hidden creatures. Unlike the dead silence of the wasteland, this place was overwhelmingly, aggressively alive. But it wasn't natural life. The colors were too vivid, the shapes too exaggerated, the sheer density of growth too rampant. This was life unleashed, mutated, cancerous. This was the emerald contagion. The steel door swung shut behind him with another hiss and a heavy thud, plunging the immediate area around him into deeper shadow, lit only by the ambient bioluminescence from the jungle below. He fumbled for a switch near the door, finding none. He was locked in, or at least, getting back out would require turning that heavy wheel again. He gripped the railing, peering down into the verdant chaos. The catwalk stretched forward, rusty but seemingly intact, disappearing into the dense foliage further ahead. It seemed to be the only path through the upper levels of the biodome. Descending into the jungle floor looked suicidal. The vegetation was too thick, and he had no doubt dangerous things lurked within those shadows. He needed to find a way through, another exit that hopefully led back to the hotel corridor, or at least somewhere less immediately threatening than the nuclear winter or the jungle floor. He started walking cautiously along the catwalk, his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the humid air. The metal groaned under his weight, and sections felt disturbingly weak. As he moved deeper into the biodome, the sounds of the jungle intensified. Strange, flute-like calls echoed from the canopy, answered by guttural croaks from below. Occasionally, something large would crash through the undergrowth, startlingly close. He caught glimpses of movement, brightly colored lizards with too many legs skittering up pulsing tree trunks, insects the size of his hand buzzing past with iridescent wings, and once, a pair of glowing yellow eyes watching him from the darkness between two giant ferns before vanishing. He kept walking, scanning his surroundings constantly. He noticed scientific equipment half buried in the rampant growth, control consoles overgrown with vines, shattered containment tubes filled with pulsating slime mold, rusted robotic arms frozen mid-task. This place was a laboratory, one where an experiment had gone catastrophically wrong, breaching containment, and turning the facility itself into a monstrous, self-propagating ecosystem. He found a small alcove off the main catwalk, perhaps an old observation post. Inside, partially shielded from the dripping moisture, was a small metal desk fused to the wall. On it lay a laminated ID badge, surprisingly intact. He picked it up. The photo showed a stern-looking woman in a lab coat. The name read, Dr. Lena Petrova, Project Chimera Lead. Below the name, text warned, Level 5 biocontainment protocols active. Seeing the forbidden name felt like a cruel joke orchestrated by the hotel itself. He almost dropped it, a chill running down his spine despite the heat, but forced himself to pocket it. Information was information, even if it felt cursed. Beside the badge lay a data slate, its screen cracked, but when he pressed the power button, it flickered weakly to life. Most files were corrupted, but one log entry remained partially legible. Date corrupted. Containment breach sector Gamma. CRSPR strains R7 and X12 synergistic reaction. Unexpected acceleration. Flora reclaiming facility. Fauna adapting. Aggression escalating. Evacuate. Command unresponsive. Security overrides failing. Sentinel protocols activated but data corrupted. God help us, the green, it thinks. The screen died, the battery finally giving out. The green, it thinks. The words sent another shiver through Jax. This wasn't just rampant growth, it was potentially sentient growth. The way the flowers seemed to track him, the feeling of being watched, it wasn't paranoia. Suddenly, a high-pitched shriek echoed from further down the catwalk, followed by the sound of tearing metal and a choked scream, unmistakably human this time. Jax froze, every nerve ending firing. He wasn't alone on the catwalks. He peered cautiously around the corner of the alcove. Further along the walkway, maybe 50 yards away where the catwalk turned, he saw movement. A figure was struggling, entangled in thick, thorny vines that seemed to have erupted from the catwalk floor itself, pulling him down. The figure wore academic robes, disheveled and torn, clutching a strange, whirring brass device covered in dials and lenses. It was the man from Penelope Vance's vague description, the academic trying to map the hotel, Emeric Blackwood. Blackwood cried out again as the vines tightened, thorns piercing his robes. He frantically twisted dials on his brass contraption, which emitted sparks and whining noises, but seemed to have no effect on the attacking flora. Jax hesitated. Helping him meant heading deeper into this green hell, towards whatever intelligence controlled the vines. But leaving him meant abandoning the only other person he'd seen who wasn't hotel staff or an obvious monster. Blackwood might have knowledge, might know a way out. Besides, watching someone be consumed by sentient plants wasn't something Jax could easily stomach, not after the frozen figures in the bus. "Hey," Jax shouted, his voice sounding thin in the vast space. "Hold on." Blackwood twisted his head towards the sound, his eyes wide with panic behind thick spectacles. "Help me, it's the phytomorphic consciousness, it's integrating me." Jax looked around desperately. No weapons, just the rusted catwalk and the encroaching jungle. He spotted a loose piece of railing nearby, a rusted pipe section about 3 feet long. He wrenched it free with a screech of protesting metal. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He started running towards Blackwood, his boots clanging on the metal walkway. The air grew thicker, sweeter, the scent of the blossoms almost overpowering. As he got closer, he saw the vines weren't just thorny. They were pulsing faintly, and where they pierced Blackwood's skin, faint green lines were spreading under the surface, like bioluminescent veins. He reached the struggling academic and swung the pipe hard at the base of the thickest vine wrapped around Blackwood's leg. The impact was jarringly soft, like hitting dense rubber, but the vine recoiled slightly, releasing a shower of glowing green spores. "Don't let the spores touch you," Blackwood gasped, batting them away frantically with his device. Accelerated assimilation. Jax swung again, harder this time, aiming for the point where the vines erupted from the catwalk floor. Metal shrieked as the pipe connected with something harder beneath the plant matter. The vines writhed, tightening their grip on Blackwood, who let out another strangled cry. From the jungle floor below, a low, resonant chittering sound rose up, as if the entire ecosystem was reacting to the assault. The very catwalk beneath their feet seemed to vibrate faintly. Jax knew they didn't have much time. He had to free Blackwood, and they had to get out of this biodome, away from the thinking green. But the only way seemed to be forward, deeper into the heart of the emerald contagion. Chapter 4: Symbiosis and Static. Jax swung the pipe again, grunting with the effort. It connected with the pulsing green mass at the base of the vines with a sickening, fleshy thud. More spores erupted, a cloud of glittering emerald dust that Jax desperately tried to avoid inhaling, batting it away with his arm while trying to keep his balance on the swaying catwalk. The air was thick with the cloying scent, stinging his nostrils. "Mind the assimilation factor," Blackwood shrieked, wrestling futilely against the tendrils binding his chest. One thorny vine snaked dangerously close to his neck. He jabbed his brass contraption. Jax could now see it resembled a complex, multi-lensed compass fused with what looked like vacuum tubes towards the vine. It spat a brief shower of blue sparks, accompanied by a high-pitched whine, and the vine recoiled slightly, momentarily loosening its grip, but others instantly tightened. "My temporal resonator, calibrated for temporal flux, not aggressive flora." The chittering from the jungle floor grew louder, rising in pitch and intensity. It wasn't just insects. It sounded like thousands of creatures stirring, agitated by the struggle above. Jax risked a glance down. Shapes moved in the phosphorescent undergrowth, multi-limbed shadows, things that skittered too fast to identify, drawn by the commotion. The entire biodome felt like it was focusing its hostile attention on them. "We need to cut it free," Jax yelled, scanning the base of the vines desperately. The pipe wasn't doing enough damage. It was like hitting a giant, rubbery tumor. The vines seemed to emerge directly from a corroded section of the catwalk grating, pulsing with that faint inner light. Blackwood, gasping, pointed a trembling finger towards the main junction point. The vascular node, disrupt the nutrient flow." Jax followed his gesture. Right where the thickest mass of vines erupted from the metal, there was a section that glowed brighter, a sickly yellow-green light pulsing rhythmically within the plant tissue. He swung the pipe, aiming for that node. The impact sent jolts up his arm, but this time something gave. A dark, viscous fluid, thick as sap but smelling foully metallic, spurted from the wound. The vines spasmed violently, lashing out. One whipped past Jax's face, close enough for him to feel the wind and smell its rank odor. Blackwood cried out as the constricting pressure intensified momentarily, then, blessedly, began to slacken. The pulsing light in the node flickered erratically. "Again," Blackwood urged, finding a surge of adrenaline. He triggered his device again, aiming the sparks at the vine near his neck. It sizzled and withdrew sharply. Jax swung the pipe one last time with all his might, hitting the damaged node squarely. There was a wet tearing sound, and the central mass split open further, spilling more foul fluid. The vines went limp, rapidly deflating, their inner light fading. They remained wrapped around Blackwood, but the aggressive tension was gone. Jax quickly grabbed the now flaccid tendrils and pulled them away from the academic, the thorns scraping uselessly against the fabric of his robes. Blackwood collapsed onto the grating, coughing and gasping for air. Green lines, faint but undeniable, pulsed beneath the skin of his arms and neck where the thorns had pierced him. The spores, the fluid, accelerated symbiosis. He wheezed, clutching his chest. "Can you walk?" Jax asked urgently, hauling him partly upright. The sounds from below were getting closer. He could hear distinct clicking and scrabbling on the support pillars beneath the catwalk. I think so. Need to counteract the integration." Blackwood fumbled with his temporal resonator, twisting dials with shaking hands. The device hummed, emitting a low-frequency vibration that Jax could feel through the soles of his boots. The green lines under Blackwood's skin seemed to pulse in time with the hum but didn't immediately recede. Need a stable temporal field. Hotel corridor might work. Paradoxical, I know. "Later," Jax said grimly, pulling Blackwood along. "We need to move now." They half stumbled, half ran along the rickety catwalk, deeper into the biodome. Blackwood leaned heavily on Jax, his breathing shallow, occasionally muttering scientific jargon mixed with panicked curses. Jax kept glancing behind them, expecting pursuit, but nothing immediately followed onto the catwalk, though the rustling and chittering from below seemed to track their progress. "This place, Project Chimera," Blackwood gasped between breaths, "tried to accelerate evolution, combine flora and fauna traits for terraforming, used temporal catalysts derived from the hotel's inherent instability, went rogue, the entire biome. It's one interconnected, predatory consciousness now." "You knew about this place?" Jax asked, surprised. "Theoretically," Blackwood admitted. "Detected anomalous energy signatures, chronotin particle decay consistent with forced evolutionary vectors. Never expected this." He gestured weakly at the suffocating jungle. "My focus is mapping the temporal strata of the hotel itself. This wing, it's a nexus point. Doors don't just lead to rooms, they lead to solidified timelines. Apocalypses caught like flies in amber." Solidified timelines. Jax thought of the nuclear winter, the ash-covered bodies. So that place, room 713, it really happened or will happen. "Both, neither," Blackwood grimaced, clutching his side. "Time isn't linear here. Think of it like cracks in a mirror. Each crack reflects a different possibility, but they all exist simultaneously within the framework of the Annex Wing. This wing, it's profoundly unstable." He tapped his device. "This helps me navigate the micro-fluctuations usually, avoid the worst overlaps, but direct interface." He shuddered, looking at the green lines on his arm. "Overlaps," Jax remembered the jerky, static-filled bellhop. "Like that guy, Glitch." Blackwood nodded grimly. "A casualty of temporal shearing, I suspect, caught between moments. Most fade entirely. He's persistent, and there are worse things lurking in the seams. Paradox predators, chronivores." Jax thought about the description of null-zone leeches and paradox hounds from the list Penelope might have mentally shared, or that Blackwood somehow knew. He felt a chill unrelated to the wasteland he'd left behind. He quickly recounted his encounter with the bloom, the fungal horror from Subject 7, describing its appearance and aggression. Blackwood paled further if that was possible. Subject 7, that correlates with whispers I've heard. Another containment failure. Not temporal but biological, unleashed into the interstitial spaces. The corridors, Vance. Penelope Vance. She knows far more than she admits. She's not just a manager, she's a curator, or perhaps a warden. As they rounded a bend, the catwalk opened onto a wider platform, apparently a central hub. Several other walkways branched off from it, leading into different shadowed sections of the biodome. In the center of the platform stood a large, cylindrical structure overgrown with vines, possibly an old elevator shaft or access tunnel. Beside it, a bank of control consoles flickered erratically, screens cracked, keyboards tangled with roots. Suddenly, Blackwood's device let out a series of sharp, urgent beeps. He looked down at its swirling lenses. Temporal spike. Incoming. Before Jax could ask what that meant, the air shimmered violently. For a horrifying instant, the vibrant green jungle flickered out of existence, replaced by the biting cold and gray ash of the atomic twilight. Jax saw the ruined skyline, felt the freezing wind whip around him, and then, just as quickly, the jungle snapped back into place, the humid air returning like a suffocating blanket. But something had changed. Standing near the defunct consoles, where nothing had been a moment before, was the bellhop, Glitch. He stood frozen mid-step, one hand outstretched as if offering a spectral luggage tag. His form flickered rapidly, buzzing audibly, particles of static shedding from him like digital dandruff. His eyes were wide, unfocused, staring through Jax and Blackwood as if they weren't there. Then his image stuttered, skipped, and he was suddenly 5 feet to the left, facing the other direction, before snapping back to his original position. He was trapped in a loop, a ghost repeating fragmented moments from a time that no longer existed coherently for him. Jax and Blackwood instinctively froze, watching the temporally displaced entity. Glitch seemed unaware of them, trapped in his own fractured reality. But his presence was deeply unsettling, a reminder of the hotel's pervasive, reality-bending influence penetrating even these sealed-off timelines. Micro-overlap, Blackwood whispered, his voice tight with fear. Localized temporal instability, usually harmless but indicative of deeper structural weaknesses in this timeline. As if summoned by his words, a low, heavy scraping sound echoed from one of the branching catwalks obscured by shadows. It was a rhythmic, mechanical sound, utterly alien to the organic noises of the jungle. Scrape, drag, scrape, drag. Jax felt a new kind of dread creep up his spine. He recognized that sound. It was the sound of methodical, implacable effort. The sound of something heavy being moved, cleaned, or perhaps disassembled. Custodian Grim, Blackwood breathed, his eyes wide with terror. He gripped Jax's arm tightly. We need to go now. He enforces the boundaries with extreme prejudice. The scraping grew louder, closer. Whatever Grim was, he was heading towards the central platform, towards them, towards Glitch. Jax looked around frantically. Which way to go? Back the way they came was towards the jungle horrors. Staying put meant confronting whatever the custodian was. The branching catwalks led into unknown territory. The vine-covered elevator shaft in the center. The scraping stopped. A heavy silence fell, broken only by Glitch's incessant buzzing and flickering. Then, from the shadowed catwalk, a hulking figure emerged. He was massive, clad head to toe in what looked like archaic, heavily modified sanitation gear, or perhaps deep-sea diving equipment. A bulky helmet with a single dark visor obscuring his face, thick, reinforced coveralls stained with unidentifiable substances, and heavy, magnetic-looking boots that explained the scraping sound. He carried a long polearm, ending not in a blade, but in a complex device combining scrubber pads, grasping claws, and what looked disturbingly like an industrial grinder head. He moved with slow, deliberate steps, radiating an aura of cold, impersonal menace. He completely ignored Jax and Blackwood, his dark visor fixed squarely on the flickering form of Glitch. Grim raised his polearm device. The grinder head began to spin with a low, menacing whine. Glitch continued his looping, unaware, trapped between seconds. Jax knew, with chilling certainty, that they were about to witness some form of temporal sanitation, and he had no desire to be next on the custodian's list. Chapter 5: Vertical Descent. Custodian Grim advanced on the flickering form of Glitch with the implacable slowness of a glacier. The whine of the grinder head on his polearm intensified, a high-pitched keening that scraped against Jax's sanity. Glitch remained oblivious, trapped in his endless loop. Offer tag, retract, turn, snap back, static discharge. A ghost caught in the stuttering playback of a broken machine. Jax and Blackwood pressed themselves back against the vine-choked railing, trying to be invisible. Blackwood fumbled with his temporal resonator, twisting dials frantically. "Need to dampen our chronoton signature," he hissed, sweat beading on his forehead despite the biodome's humidity. The faint green lines under his skin pulsed more rapidly now, seemingly agitated by his fear or the proximity of Grim's device. Grim reached Glitch. He didn't speak, didn't hesitate. He simply swung the polearm. But instead of striking the bellhop, the complex head of the device, the scrubber pads, the claws, the grinder, passed through Glitch's flickering form as if he were smoke. For a split second, nothing happened. Then Glitch's buzzing static intensified exponentially. His looping movements became frantic, blurred, overlapping. His image seemed to tear, colors smearing like wet paint. A silent scream distorted his face, his mouth opening impossibly wide, revealing not anatomy but swirling television static. The grinder head wasn't grinding physical matter, it was grinding time. It was unraveling the temporal anomaly that was Glitch. The air crackled with energy. Glitch's form dissolved rapidly, fragmenting into frantic particles of light and noise, collapsing inward like a dying star. The buzzing reached an unbearable crescendo, then abruptly cut out, leaving behind only a faint smell of ozone and burnt circuits. Where Glitch had stood, there was nothing but empty air and a few drifting motes of residual static. Grim lowered his polearm, the grinder spinning down with a low whine. He stood motionless for a moment, his dark visor surveying the platform, sweeping slowly past Jax and Blackwood without any sign of recognition or interest. It was as if they simply didn't register, or perhaps weren't currently violating whatever arcane protocols he enforced. His task, the erasure of the temporal irregularity, was complete. Then, with the same slow, deliberate pace, he turned and began to head back towards the shadowed catwalk he'd emerged from, his heavy boots resuming their rhythmic scrape. Drag, scrape, drag. Jax let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his entire body trembling. Blackwood sagged against the railing, looking nauseous. Incredible, localized temporal erasure, the energy required. Less analyzing, more moving, Jax snapped, grabbing Blackwood's arm again. Grimm might be leaving now, but who knew when he might return, or what else lurked in this green hell or the corridors beyond. The elevator shaft, it's our only way off this platform. They scrambled towards the vine-choked cylindrical structure in the center of the hub. Thick, woody vines, pulsing with the same faint light as the rest of the biome, covered the metal doors completely, sealing them shut. Jax shoved at them. It was like pushing against solid wood. "My turn," Blackwood wheezed, raising his temporal resonator again. He adjusted the dials, aiming the multi-lensed emitter at the densest part of the vine growth over the elevator doors. "If I can introduce a minor desynchronization field, might disrupt the cellular cohesion." He activated the device. It hummed, emitting waves of distortion that made the air shimmer. The vines writhed, recoiling slightly from the energy bath. The faint green lines on Blackwood's own arms glowed brighter, and he hissed in pain, clutching his head. "Feedback loop. It's connected." "Stop!" Jax yelled, seeing Blackwood tremble violently. But it was too late. The resonator sparked, sputtered, and died with a pop, emitting a puff of acrid smoke. Blackwood cried out, stumbling back, the green lines under his skin now glowing with an almost painful intensity. However, the energy pulse had worked, after a fashion. The thickest vines over the elevator doors had withered slightly, turning brown and brittle, loosening their grip just enough. Jax seized the opportunity, jamming the end of his pipe into the gap between the doors and prying with all his might. Metal groaned, brittle vines snapped, and one of the heavy doors creaked inwards a few inches. Working together, panting and sweating, they managed to force the door open just wide enough to slip through into the darkness beyond. Jax practically shoved the weakened Blackwood inside, then squeezed through himself, pulling the door partially closed behind them just as a new chorus of clicks and guttural growls rose from the jungle floor, closer this time. They found themselves in pitch darkness, the air thick with the smell of damp, decay, and engine oil. It was the elevator shaft, all right. Jax fumbled for his phone, relieved to find the battery still had some charge, and switched on the flashlight app. The weak beam cut through the oppressive blackness, illuminating a narrow, claustrophobic space. Rusty cables hung limply from unseen heights above, disappearing into the abyss below. An emergency maintenance ladder was bolted to the curved wall beside them, coated in slime and indeterminate growths. The elevator car itself was nowhere in sight, perhaps crashed at the bottom, or stalled somewhere far above or below. The shaft plummeted into darkness, and faint, Unsettling sounds echoed up from the depths, dripping water, scurrying noises, and a low, intermittent hum. Down, Jax decided, playing the light on the ladder. It's the only way. Blackwood nodded weakly, leaning against the slimy wall. Gravity, a reliable constant at least. The green glow under his skin seemed fainter in the darkness, but Jax could see him shivering, whether from reaction to the temporal feedback, the encroaching symbiosis, or simple fear. He couldn't tell. "How are you feeling?" Jax asked, trying to keep the edge out of his voice. Like my cellular structure is arguing with itself," Blackwood mumbled. "The green. It wants to integrate, adapt, survive. My own biology is resisting. The resonator's discharge accelerated the conflict." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Need to get back to the hotel's baseline temporal field. Might stabilize me." "Right down first." Jax gripped the slimy ladder rungs. They felt precarious, slick with moisture and patches of weird, rubbery fungus. He started climbing down, phone held precariously in his mouth to light the way, the beam dancing nervously on the greasy metal and dripping walls. Blackwood followed, moving slowly, his breathing labored. The descent was nerve-wracking. The darkness pressed in, absolute beyond the small circle of light. Every drip of water echoed like a gunshot. The air grew colder, damper, losing the jungle's humidity but gaining a subterranean chill. Strange molds and fungi coated the walls in bizarre patterns, some glowing faintly with their own sickly luminescence. Jax occasionally shone the light upwards, seeing only endless cables disappearing into blackness, and downwards, revealing nothing but more shaft dropping away into the void. They descended past several more sealed elevator doors, marking different floors or sections of the biodome they hadn't seen. Occasionally, Jax would catch glimpses through cracks or grates of other environments. A flash of sterile white suggesting a functioning lab, a flicker of intense heat and orange light like a furnace room, once even a brief, terrifying glimpse of open water teeming with tentacled shapes before they passed it. This shaft seemed to connect multiple zones, multiple horrors. "The hotel's foundations," Blackwood whispered hoarsely from below Jax, his voice echoing strangely. "They say it was built on a nexus, a place where realities bleed together. The Annex Wing isn't just an extension, it's built into the weak points, tapping the energy, containing the bleed-through, or amplifying it." Amplifying. Why? Jax called down, struggling with a particularly rusted section of ladder. "Power, knowledge, or maybe the hotel itself. Maybe it feeds on it," Blackwood coughed again. "Feeds on the possibilities, the despair." Suddenly, Jax's light caught something below them. Not the ladder continuing, but movement. Something pale and multi-limbed was scurrying up the shaft wall towards them, moving with unnatural speed. It looked disturbingly like bleached, elongated centipedes fused together, studded with small, unblinking eyes that reflected the light. "Company!" Jax yelled, quickening his descent, heart pounding. Blackwood looked down, saw the approaching horror, and cried out, losing his grip on the slimy rung. He slid several feet, scrabbling desperately, before Jax managed to grab the back of his robes, halting his fall. The sudden weight nearly pulled Jax off the ladder himself. "Hold on," Jax grunted, straining. The pale things were closer now, skittering over the rungs below Blackwood, their multiple legs making unnerving tapping sounds on the metal. Just then, Jax's light fell on a partially open emergency hatch set into the shaft wall only a few feet below their current position. It was small, rectangular, and looked like it led into a narrow maintenance tunnel. Their only chance. "The hatch," Jax yelled. "Get to the hatch." He half lowered, half dropped Blackwood the remaining distance, the academic landing awkwardly on the narrow ledge beside the hatch. Jax scrambled down after him just as the first of the pale climbers reached the rung he'd vacated. He slammed his boot down hard on its segmented body. It crunched sickeningly, emitting a high-pitched squeal, but others swarmed upwards relentlessly. Blackwood was already tugging frantically at the hatch door. It was jammed, rusted shut on one side. Jax added his weight, pulling alongside him. The metal groaned in protest. The pale things were swarming onto the ledge now, their tiny eyes gleaming in the flashlight beam, mandibles clicking hungrily. One lunged towards Blackwood's leg. With a final, desperate heave, the hatch tore open with a screech of tortured metal, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel beyond. Jax kicked the closest creature away, sending it tumbling into the abyss and shoved Blackwood through the opening. He scrambled in after him, turning to pull the heavy hatch closed just as several more of the pale horrors tried to surge through the gap. He slammed it shut, the heavy thud echoing in the confined space, cutting off the skittering sounds and the sight of the clicking mandibles. He fumbled in the darkness, finding a heavy locking bar on the inside, and slammed it into place. Silence, darkness. Jax leaned against the cold metal of the hatch, chest heaving, phone flashlight beam dancing wildly around the confined tunnel. Blackwood lay slumped on the floor nearby, coughing violently, the faint green lines under his skin flickering like faulty neon. They were out of the shaft, but where they had ended up was anyone's guess. The air here was stale, smelling of dust and something else. Something dry and ancient, like disturbed earth or crumbling parchment. They had escaped the emerald contagion and the horrors of the shaft, only to find themselves in yet another unknown corner of the Chronos Hotel's sprawling nightmare. Chapter 6. Dust and Decrepitude. The echoing thud of the locking bar slamming home faded, leaving Jax and Blackwood enveloped in profound silence and near-absolute darkness. The only light came from Jax's phone, its beam carving a shaky circle out of the oppressive black, illuminating the narrow confines of the maintenance tunnel. Dust motes, thick and ancient, danced in the beam, stirred by their ragged breathing. The air was incredibly stale, heavy with the scent Jax had noticed before: dry earth, crumbling paper, and a faint, unsettlingly sweet odor underneath, like decaying flowers or improperly embalmed corpses. Jax leaned against the cold, heavy metal of the hatch, catching his breath, his heart still hammering from the frantic escape. He shone the light on Blackwood, who was slumped against the tunnel wall, coughing rackingly. The cough sounded worse now, wetter, deeper. The faint green bioluminescence under his skin pulsed weakly, almost drowned out by the flashlight. But Jax noticed something new. Fine, moss-like filaments were beginning to sprout from the edges of the green patches on his arms, tiny, hair-like growths that weren't there before. The symbiosis wasn't stabilizing. It was accelerating, adapting to its host. "Blackwood, you all right?" Jax asked, his voice hushed in the confined space. "Define, all right," the academic rasped, wiping a trickle of sweat or slime from his brow. The biomechanisms are suboptimal, cellular mitosis competing with introduced chloroplast analogs. He coughed again, harder this time. "This air, it feels dead, devitalized, bad for the green." He paradoxically seemed both relieved and worried by this observation. Jax swept the light around the tunnel. It was narrow, barely wide enough for two men to stand abreast, and low enough that Jax had to stoop slightly. The walls were rough-hewn stone on one side, possibly the original bedrock the hotel was built upon, and crumbling brickwork held together with ancient, failing mortar on the other. Pipes of indeterminate age and function ran along the ceiling and floor, coated in thick layers of dust and cobwebs that looked disturbingly sturdy. It felt incredibly old, far older than the rest of the hotel he'd seen, like a forgotten artery deep beneath the building's more modern layers. The tunnel stretched away into darkness in both directions. There was no obvious sign indicating which way led towards safety, or if safety was even a concept that applied here. "Which way?" Jax asked, playing the light down one direction, then the other. Both looked equally uninviting, disappearing into blackness. Blackwood squinted, trying to focus. He held up his hand, the one still relatively free of the visible green filaments. "Wait, the air currents, faint, but moving left to right from our perspective facing the tunnel." He pointed down the corridor to their right. "Suggests ventilation, or at least an outlet that way." It was as good a reason as any. "Okay, let's go. Lean on me if you need to." They started walking, Jax keeping the light steady ahead, Blackwood shuffling beside him, occasionally stumbling on the uneven floor. The silence was profound, broken only by their footsteps crunching on grit and fallen mortar, and Blackwood's increasingly frequent, rattling coughs. The dry, dusty smell intensified as they moved deeper, the faint, sweet undertone becoming slightly more prominent. After walking for what felt like 10 minutes, the tunnel began to change. The rough stone gave way to more uniform, dressed stone blocks, fitted tightly together. Arched alcoves appeared at regular intervals along the brickwork side, most filled with rubble or collapsed debris, but some disturbingly empty like vacant crypts. This wasn't just a maintenance tunnel. It felt like part of an older structure, catacombs perhaps, swallowed by the hotel's construction. In one alcove, Jax's light fell upon something that made him stop dead. It was a skeleton, slumped against the back wall, clad in the tattered remnants of what looked like early 20th century clothing. Its bony fingers were clamped around a small, leather-bound diary. Dust coated everything, suggesting it had been here for decades. "Another guest who couldn't check out," Blackwood murmured darkly, peering at the scene. Jax hesitated, then cautiously approached. He nudged the diary with the toe of his boot. It didn't crumble, surprisingly well preserved in the dry air. Driven by a desperate need for answers, he crouched down, avoiding looking directly at the skull's empty sockets, and gently pried the diary from the skeleton's grasp. The skeletal fingers snapped with dry clicks, but released their grip. He stood up, brushing thick dust from the worn leather cover. There was no title, just faded gold tooling around the edges. He opened it carefully. The pages were brittle, filled with cramped, spidery handwriting in faded brown ink. The first entry was dated October 1928. October 17, 1928. Arrived at the magnificent Chronos Hotel. Opulent beyond measure. Booked a room in the newly opened temporal wing on a whim. The clerk spoke of witnessing history. Rather thrilling, if unorthodox. Jax exchanged a look with Blackwood. Temporal wing. Annex Wing. It seemed the hotel had been experimenting with its unique properties for a long time. He flipped through the pages, scanning entries. October 19th. Remarkable. Room 303 afforded me a perfect view of the Colosseum, circa 80 AD. The sounds, the smells, positively transportive. Felt a momentary dizziness upon returning to the corridor, however. Must be the temporal displacement. October 22nd. Visited Napoleonic France today via room 315. Fascinating but unsettling, the figures seem. Less like projections, more like echoes. Saw a soldier stare directly at me through the window. Penelope, the floor manager, an eerily ageless woman, assures me it's perfectly safe. Jax's blood ran cold. Penelope Vance, floor manager, in 1928. Was she immortal, a construct? Or was the name, like Petrova, just another cruel temporal echo reused by the hotel? He skipped further ahead, the entries becoming more frantic, paranoid. November 5th. Something is wrong. The timelines are bleeding. Saw Roman legionaries marching down the corridor yesterday. Heard cannon fire from 315 while I was supposedly in Victorian London, room 309. The windows flicker now. Sometimes they show static, or things I cannot comprehend, eyes in the walls. November 10th. Tried to leave. Penelope smiled and said my reservation was temporally binding. The main elevators won't respond to my floor. Found these service tunnels, trying to find a way out. Walls whisper, dust breathes. November 14th. Lost, tunnel shifting, saw figures wrapped in linens, shambling in the dark, not echoes, real, ancient, from a time before the hotel or something the hotel unearthed, cold, so cold, they smell of dust and decay. The last entry trailed off into illegible scratches. Jax closed the diary slowly, the silence of the tunnel pressing in. Figures wrapped in linens, shambling, smelling of dust and decay, that faint sweet smell. Mummified entities, Blackwood whispered, his voice trembling. The hotel isn't just built on a nexus, it's built through older strata, possibly burial sites. The temporal instability, it could reanimate things best left undisturbed. The green filaments on his arms seem to twitch. Or perhaps they are another form of containment failure, exhibits that escape their designated timeline. As if on cue, a low moan echoed from further down the tunnel. It wasn't the wind, it was dry, rattling, ancient, followed by the soft, insidious sound of dragging footsteps, something shuffling slowly through the dust. Jax shoved the diary into his jacket pocket, heart hammering. He swept the flashlight beam down the corridor in the direction of the sound. The tunnel curved slightly ahead, obscuring the source, but the shuffling was getting closer. "Back," Jax hissed, pushing Blackwood behind him. "We need to go back, find another way." They turned, stumbling back the way they came, panic lending speed to their movements. But as they retreated, another low moan echoed from behind them, from the direction they had just explored. The shuffling sound started up there too, slow, deliberate, inevitable. They were trapped, caught between whatever was shambling towards them from both directions. Jax frantically shone the light around, searching for an escape. An alcove, a side passage. The walls were mostly solid here, dressed stone and crumbling brick. Then the beam caught it, a low, arched doorway on the stone wall side, previously hidden in shadow and dust. It was made of dark, heavy wood, bound with black iron strips, looking impossibly ancient. A simple iron ring served as a handle. There, Jax grabbed Blackwood's arm, pulling him towards the door. "Try it." Blackwood threw his weight against the door. It didn't budge. Jax joined him, shoulder first. The wood groaned, thick and unyielding. The shuffling sounds were closer now, just around the bends in the tunnel from both directions. Jax could almost smell the dry, cloying sweetness intensifying. He slammed his shoulder against the door again, desperation giving him strength. There was a sharp crack, not the door, but the locking mechanism within the frame. He hit it again. The door sprang inwards with a gust of even staler, colder air, revealing steps leading down into absolute blackness. "Go," Jax yelled, practically throwing Blackwood through the opening. He risked a glance down the tunnel to his left. A figure was just rounding the bend, silhouetted against the faint ambient gloom. Tall, gaunt, wrapped head to toe in stained, decaying linen bandages. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, limbs stiff. It turned its swaddled head towards the light, revealing only dark shadows beneath the wrappings, and let out another dry, rattling moan. Jax scrambled through the doorway after Blackwood, grabbing the iron ring and pulling the heavy door shut. There was no obvious lock on this side, just solid, ancient wood. He braced himself against it as something heavy thumped against the other side, followed by dry, scraping sounds, like bony fingers searching for purchase. He flicked the flashlight beam around their new refuge. They were at the top of a narrow, spiral staircase carved directly from the stone, leading down into terrifying darkness. The air here was colder still, utterly stagnant, carrying the same smell of dust and decay, but stronger now, mingled with something else. Something metallic, like old blood. Blackwood was huddled on the top step, shivering uncontrollably, the green filaments on his skin now visibly writhing. "Bad place," he choked out. "Very old, very wrong. The green. It hates this." The scraping continued on the other side of the door. Jax knew the thick wood wouldn't hold forever. Their only option was down, deeper into the forgotten depths beneath the Chronos Hotel. He gripped the cold stone wall for support, took a deep breath that filled his lungs with the stench of ages, and began the descent into the waiting dark. Chapter 7: The Heart of the Foundation. The darkness swallowed the feeble beam of Jax's phone flashlight almost immediately as they descended the spiral staircase. Each step downwards felt like a step further away from any semblance of reality, deeper into the cold, dead heart of whatever forgotten age lay crushed beneath the foundations of the Chronos Hotel. The air grew thick and heavy. the stench of dust and decay becoming almost suffocating, underscored by that persistent metallic tang of old blood. Behind them, the scraping and thudding against the heavy wooden door continued, a relentless reminder that the shuffling horrors were still trying to reach them. The steps were uneven, worn smooth in places by the passage of centuries, perhaps, or millennia. Water dripped somewhere in the echoing dark, a slow, rhythmic plink that did little to alleviate the oppressive silence. Jax kept one hand on the freezing, curved stone wall for balance, the other gripping his phone, while Blackwood stumbled behind him, leaning heavily against the central pillar of the spiral, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The green, it's retracting, Blackwood choked out between coughs. This place negates the biotemporal energy, too old, too static. It's pulling back inside me, but it feels wrong, like compressing a spring. The faint bioluminescence beneath his skin was almost gone now, but his shivering had intensified and his skin had taken on a sickly gray pallor in the flashlight beam. The moss-like filaments seemed to have stopped growing but looked brittle, almost fossilized. "Just keep moving," Jax urged, though his own fear was a cold knot in his stomach. This place felt fundamentally wrong, ancient, and inimical. What had the diary author written? A time before the hotel, or something the hotel unearthed? The staircase seemed to go on forever, spiraling down into the black void. The thudding from the door above grew fainter, though whether because of distance or because their pursuers had given up, Jax couldn't tell. He didn't dare hope for the latter. Finally, after what felt like an age, the stairs ended. They opened out not into a tunnel or room, but onto a narrow ledge overlooking a vast, cavernous space. Jax cautiously swept the flashlight beam across it. His breath caught in his throat. They were standing on the edge of an immense natural cavern, easily the size of several cathedrals. But it wasn't entirely natural. Strange, impossible architecture fused with the rock formations. Jagged pillars of black, obsidian-like material, humming faintly with resonant energy, pierced the cavern floor and ceiling. Faint geometric patterns, glowing with a weak, internal crimson light, were carved into the cavern walls, intersecting with ancient stalactites and stalagmites. In the center of the cavern floor, partially submerged in a dark, still pool of water that reflected the crimson light like blood, stood a colossal structure unlike anything Jax had ever seen. It resembled a gigantic, petrified heart, easily 50 feet tall, formed from the same black, humming obsidian. Vein-like structures pulsed with the faint crimson light, running across its surface and connecting it to the pillars and carved patterns on the walls. The air here thrummed with low-frequency vibrations emanating from the structure, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in Jax's teeth and bones. The source of the metallic smell was stronger here, emanating from the dark pool surrounding the heart. This was the source, the foundation, the nexus Blackwood spoke of. "My God," Blackwood whispered, sinking to his knees on the ledge, staring at the impossible sight with a mixture of terror and academic awe. "Pre-human, non-Euclidean. This isn't just a nexus point. The hotel was built around this. To contain it, exploit it." "Whatever it is, I don't like it," Jax said, his eyes scanning the cavern. He saw no immediate threats, no mummies, no fungal horrors. But the sheer wrongness of the place, The palpable ancient energy radiating from the obsidian heart felt more dangerous than any monster. We need to find a way out. He shone the light along the ledge. It continued around the cavern wall, narrow and precarious. Far below, pathways of the same black material snaked between the pillars on the cavern floor, leading towards the central heart structure. There were no obvious exits at their level. Suddenly, Blackwood gasped, clutching his chest. He convulsed, falling onto his side, his body racked with violent tremors. The green filaments on his arms flared brightly for a second, then seemed to crumble into dust, leaving angry red welts behind. He cried out, a raw sound of agony. "Blackwood, what is it?" Jax knelt beside him, phone light illuminating the academic's contorted face. "The green, fighting the resonance," he gasped. "Receding too fast, cellular cascade failure. It can't survive here, but it integrated too deeply, ripping itself free." His eyes rolled back in his head and his body arched off the ledge. Jax grabbed him, pulling him back from the edge just as a final, violent tremor shook Blackwood's frame. Then he went limp, unconscious, his breathing shallow, deathly faint. The last traces of green faded from his skin, leaving it looking gray and lifeless. Jax checked his pulse. It was thready, weak. Blackwood was dying, the failed symbiosis tearing him apart from the inside out now that the sustaining biotemporal energy was gone. Jax felt a surge of despair. Alone again, in a place that felt like the bottom of reality, with a dying man and no clear way out. He looked from Blackwood's still form to the colossal, humming heart in the center of the cavern. Did salvation or ultimate damnation lie down there? As he contemplated their impossible situation, a section of the crimson geometric patterns carved into the far cavern wall suddenly pulsed brighter. A low grinding sound echoed across the vast space. A section of the rock face retracted, revealing not a tunnel but a gleaming modern elevator door, identical to those in the main hotel lobby. The Chronos Hotel insignia, a stylized clock face, glowed softly above it. Hope surged through Jax, wild and desperate. An elevator down here, a way out. But then the elevator doors slid open with a soft ding. Standing inside, bathed in the warm, conventional light of the elevator car, was Penelope Vance. Her floor manager uniform was immaculate, her placid smile firmly in place. Beside her, silent and imposing, stood Custodian Grimm, his polearm held ready, its grinder head still. Penelope looked directly at Jax, her eyes seeming to pierce the gloom effortlessly. Her smile widened slightly. "Mr. Jax and Dr. Blackwood, you've strayed quite far from the designated exhibits. Exploring the foundations are we, tusk. Access is strictly prohibited." Jax scrambled to his feet, instinctively shielding Blackwood's unconscious form. "Stay away from us." "Oh, we have no quarrel with you, Mr. Jax," Penelope said smoothly, her voice echoing slightly in the cavern. "Not directly. You've simply become inconvenient. And Dr. Blackwood's condition is a regrettable consequence of unsanctioned temporal biological interaction, a contamination." Custodian Grimm took a step forward out of the elevator onto the cavern floor far below, his magnetic boots clanking on the black pathway. He began walking towards the central heart structure, ignoring Jax and Blackwood completely for now. "What is this place?" Jax demanded, his voice hoarse. "What is that thing?" He gestured towards the obsidian heart. Penelope chuckled, a soft, chilling sound. That, that, Mr. Jax, is the engine, the anchor, the heart of the matter, you might say, the source of the hotel's unique temporal properties, ancient, powerful, and rather hungry. As she spoke, Grim reached the edge of the dark pool surrounding the heart. He activated his polearm, not the grinder head this time, but the grasping claws. He plunged the device into the dark water, which roiled violently for a moment. Then he pulled something out, something pale, struggling weakly, wrapped in remnants of cloth. It looked horrifyingly like one of the desiccated bodies from the bus in the atomic twilight vista. With methodical efficiency, Grim moved the polearm towards the pulsating obsidian heart. A section of the black surface seemed to shimmer and become momentarily fluid. Grim thrust the body into the opening, which closed immediately, leaving no trace. The crimson light within the heart pulsed brighter for a moment, and the low hum intensified, sending vibrations through the very rock beneath Jax's feet. Jax stared in horror. Feeding it. They were feeding bodies, remnants from the apocalyptic timelines, to this ancient entity. The timelines create residue, Penelope explained, her voice dropping to an almost confidential whisper. Paradoxes, echoes, fragments. They destabilize the anchor if left unchecked. The custodian performs essential maintenance. Recycling the temporal detritus maintains equilibrium and nourishes the heart, of course, a necessary symbiosis. "You're feeding people to that thing," Jax choked out, revulsion and terror warring within him. "Detritus," Penelope corrected calmly. "Fragments that have strayed too far from their intended loop, like Dr. Blackwood's unfortunate biosignature, currently causing ripples." She glanced towards Grim, who had turned from the heart and was now looking up towards the ledge, his dark visor fixed on Blackwood's unconscious form. "Containment protocols must be observed." Grim began walking towards the base of the cavern wall beneath their ledge, his polearm held ready. There was no ladder here, but Jax had a sickening feeling that wouldn't stop the custodian. Panic seized Jax. He looked at the dying Blackwood, then at the approaching Grim, then back at Penelope, still standing serenely in the elevator, watching the proceedings like a theater patron. The elevator. It was the only way. But how to reach it? It was on the far side of the cavern floor. He looked down the sheer drop from the ledge. 20, maybe 30 feet to the black pathway below. A dangerous jump, especially carrying Blackwood, but staying here meant facing Grim. He made a split-second decision. He hoisted Blackwood's dead weight over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. The academic groaned softly but remained unconscious. Jax backed away from the edge, took a deep breath, and ran towards it. "A rash decision, Mr. Jax," Penelope called out, her voice laced with amusement. "Survival probabilities are plummeting." Jax ignored her. He reached the edge and leaped, aiming for the black pathway below, praying it wasn't slick with whatever was in the pool. He hit the surface hard, pain shooting up his legs, stumbling but managing to keep his footing and hold onto Blackwood. Grim, startled by the sudden action, paused momentarily in his advance. Jax didn't waste the moment. He started running, half dragging, half carrying Blackwood along the obsidian path, heading towards the distant, beckoning light of the open elevator where Penelope Vance waited, her smile unwavering, predatory. The heart pulsed behind him, its low hum seeming to chase him, vibrating through the very soles of his boots. Escape seemed impossibly close, yet terrifyingly far. Chapter 8. The Cycle Renewed. Jax ran. He ran with Emeric Blackwood a dead weight over his shoulder, the black obsidian pathway blurring beneath his pounding feet. The air thrummed, thick with the heart's resonant hum, vibrating through his skull, making his vision swim. Behind him he heard the heavy, rhythmic clank, clank, clank of Custodian Grimm's magnetic boots quickening, closing the distance with unnerving speed. The silent giant was faster than his deliberate movements suggested. The open elevator door pulsed like a beacon of sanity at the far end of the cavern, warm light spilling onto the alien black rock. Penelope Vance stood framed within it, watching his desperate approach with the same serene, detached amusement. She made no move to close the doors, nor to urge him on. She was simply an observer, perhaps even the orchestrator, of this final, frantic act. Blackwood groaned, a low, rattling sound, his body limp and heavy. Jax risked a glance at him. The academic's face was gray, lips tinged blue. He wasn't going to make it, not without immediate, impossible medical help. But Jax couldn't leave him, not after everything. Not to be fed like refuse to that monstrous, pulsating heart. The obsidian structure dominated his peripheral vision, immense and terrifying. Its crimson light pulsed faster now, matching the frantic beat of Jax's own heart. The dark pool around its base rippled, though there was no wind. Did it sense them? Did it sense Blackwood's fatting, corrupted life force? Did it hunger? The clanking behind him was closer now. Jax could almost feel the cold presence of the custodian looming over his shoulder. He pushed himself harder, lungs burning, legs screaming in protest from the earlier jump and exertion. The elevator was only 20 feet away. 15. 10. He stumbled onto the threshold, the sudden transition from the cavern's oppressive gloom to the elevator's mundane lighting jarring his senses. Warm air, smelling faintly of disinfectant and cheap air freshener, replaced the ancient stench of dust and decay. Music played softly from a hidden speaker. It was horrifyingly normal. "Cutting it rather fine, Mr. Jax," Penelope remarked, her voice smooth as silk. She stepped aside gracefully, allowing him room. Jax practically threw Blackwood's body onto the elevator floor, collapsing beside him, gasping for air. He fumbled for the door close button, his fingers trembling. But Custodian Grimm was already there. The massive figure filled the doorway, helmeted head tilting slightly as his dark visor fixed on Blackwood's prone form. He raised his polearm, the grasping claws snapping open, reaching. "No!" Jax screamed, scrambling forward on instinct. He grabbed the edge of the heavy elevator door and threw all his weight into pulling it shut. It began to slide closed, slowly, agonizingly. Grimm reacted instantly, shoving the head of his polearm into the narrowing gap. Metal screeched against metal as the claws wedged themselves between the door and the frame, forcing it back open a few inches. Grimm's implacable strength was terrifying. Jax shoved harder, bracing his feet against the opposite wall, straining every muscle. He could see Grimm's impassive visor through the gap, feel the cold radiating from the automaton or whatever he was. Behind Grimm, the obsidian heart pulsed, its hum rising to a deafening thrum. Penelope watched the struggle with mild interest, tapping a perfectly manicured finger against her chin. "Such exertion," she murmured. "Is the specimen truly worth it?" Desperation flooded Jax. He looked at Blackwood's still face, then at the relentless machine trying to pry the door open. He wouldn't let it happen. He spotted the emergency stop button, large and red near the floor. A mad idea sparked. He released the door slightly, letting Grimm push it open another inch, then slammed his hand down on the emergency stop button while simultaneously kicking with all his might against the polearm head lodged in the gap. The elevator shuddered violently, lights flickering. The emergency brake engaged with a deafening clang. The sudden jolt, combined with Jax's kick, dislodged the polearm head. The claws scraped uselessly against the exterior as the heavy doors, freed from obstruction and powered by their closing mechanism, slid shut with final, decisive force. Thump. Silence except for the elevator's soft hum and the music. Jax stared at the closed doors, chest heaving, adrenaline turning to trembling exhaustion. He had done it. He had actually shut Grimm out. He looked up at Penelope. Her serene smile hadn't faltered. If anything, it seemed wider, tinged with something akin to approval. "Impressive," she stated simply. "Resourceful." She pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator gave another slight lurch and began to ascend smoothly, leaving the thrumming heart and the ancient cavern behind. Jax crawled over to Blackwood. He felt for a pulse again. Nothing. Emeric Blackwood was dead, his body finally succumbing to the violent cellular conflict. Another victim of the Chronos Hotel. Jax gently closed the academic's starring eyes, a wave of weariness and grief washing over him. "A shame," Penelope commented, adjusting her cufflink. Dr. Blackwood possessed a unique sensitivity to the hotel's temporal fluctuations. His research, while unauthorized, was illuminating. She sounded like she was discussing a failed lab rat. "What happens now?" Jax asked, his voice rough. "Where are you taking me?" "Why, back where you belong, Mr. Jax," Penelope replied smoothly. "The Annex Wing. Your room is waiting." "You can't. I won't go back there. Not after this. I know what this place is." Penelope chuckled softly. "Oh, you know a fraction, Mr. Jax. A glimpse into the foundations. The hotel is far older, far deeper than you can imagine. The Annex Wing, the vistas, they are merely the periphery, necessary pressure valves and observation points." "Observation. You're watching people suffer through the end of the world." "We observe possibilities," she corrected. "Potential timelines. Some flourish, some decay, some end abruptly. The heart requires balance. The hotel persists, and guests provide resonance, energy. Even their despair is a form of sustenance." The elevator slowed, the soft ding sounding again. The doors slid open. Jax braced himself, expecting the main lobby, security, anything. but he was met with the chillingly familiar sight of the desolate gray corridor of the Annex Wing. The air was cold, carrying the faint metallic tang and the smell of ozone. In the distance, the lights flickered erratically. Directly opposite the elevator was room 713, its scarred wooden door looking mundane yet radiating menace. His room, the atomic twilight. Penelope gestured gracefully towards the corridor. Checkout procedures remain complex, Mr. Jax. Perhaps further immersion is required before you're ready for that conversation. She looked down at Blackwood's body without pity. Leave that. Grimm performs sanitation duties throughout the facility. It will be recycled. Revulsion churned in Jax's gut. He couldn't leave Blackwood here to be fed to that thing. But what could he do? He was exhausted, unarmed, facing an entity of unknown power who controlled this nightmare realm. He felt utterly defeated. He stood up slowly, his legs shaky. He clutched the diary in his pocket, felt the cool weight of the tarnished locket. They were meaningless trinkets against the cosmic horror of this place. "Enjoy the remainder of your stay," Penelope said, her smile unwavering. The elevator doors began to slide shut behind him. Just before they closed, she added, almost as an afterthought, "Oh, and Mr. Jax, do be careful. Subject 7 is still unaccounted for. Happy hunting." The doors closed, leaving Jax alone in the corridor, the silence broken only by the distant flickering lights and the faint, imagined clicking of a Geiger counter from behind the door of room 713. Blackwood's body lay still at his feet. He looked down the long, shifting corridor. He saw a flicker of movement far away, the stuttering static of glitch perhaps already reforming or replaced. He heard a faint, wet, dragging sound from the opposite direction, punctuated by a low, bubbling moan. The bloom was still here, still hunting. He wasn't free. He hadn't escaped. He had merely completed a circuit, returning to the periphery after glimpsing the horrifying core. The Annex Wing wasn't just a collection of rooms. It was a hunting ground, a maze, a cycle of curated apocalypses. And he was still trapped within it, armed only with the terrible knowledge he now possessed and the chilling certainty that the Chronos Hotel was eternal, indifferent, and ravenous. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold air burning his lungs, and turned away from the elevator, back towards the nightmare he now knew intimately. His stay was far from over. The cycle was renewed. The end.